We'll be starting up here in a couple of minutes, so log on in, grab your cup of coffee, and get ready to talk about planning. But maybe not what you were thinking, but we'll see. We'll be starting up in about 1 more minute. While you're waiting, you might want to go ahead and open up your pods. We're going to be using the chat pod to send you information and links. There'll be links popping up in there throughout the course of the webinar this morning. We'll also be using the Q&A to get feedback from you, which we'll be using. We'll be asking you to raise your hand, so be ready to do that. And then, of course, you might want to go ahead and get ready to do polls. In fact, I will go ahead and pop that up so people can see the polls that we're going to be taking using pollev.com. And again, if you can't access the polls, we can always do it via the Q&A. So definitely want that Q&A open. Give folks about 30 seconds to log in, and then we will get started. Okay, good morning, and welcome to the last of our summer engineering webinar, or summer engineering. I'm looking at the next slide too much. Look, last of our topical Tuesday webinars, foundational webinars that we're doing for the summer of 2023. But we're already planning next year's whole series of webinars. In fact, the handout, which will be in your chat pod, you open the chat pod, you get a link, so you don't have to memorize it. List the draft schedule. We don't have a final schedule yet, but it does list the draft. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the LTAP Center here in New York State, part of the Cornell Local Roads program. And we're going to finish up our series on the planning process. And of course, this is part of everything that we do. We have our bumper banter normally on Monday. So today we did it about a half an hour ago. Want to do it before the webinar. We figured I just knew what my schedule was going to be like afterwards. Topical Tuesdays, our summer engineering stuff. Again, we have one next week, which I'll talk about. Our fall workshops, requested workshops, and then of course field visits. And of course, if there's anything you need from us, just let us know. Now, in terms of our fall workshops, we do want you to sign up at the end of this, and on the handout, you'll see links. So you can sign up, but we've already had to do some canceling because the numbers. We have to have a minimum just to make it economically justifiable to get out to a site. And we have to let folks know about 2 weeks in advance. Jody and Amanda, who are behind and will allow me to do things, need to know in advance so we can get our circuit riders and other instructors set to go. The icon I really want to use is the one with lots of people, which means the workshop is full. That's the one I really want to use, but not the X's. Again, if you haven't already, open up your chat pod, open up your Q&A pod. We'll be sending you a message via chat, though chat is disabled from you putting things in, but that is where we can send you links for getting the handout, getting links to the web, and accessing PolEV. And we may ask you to raise your hand. In fact, I'll probably do that here in a couple of minutes. This session is worth 1 professional development hour for engineers here in New York State. But remember, it's only the person who is registered who gets that credit, but it does count as a course. So that's a good thing. And if you're from another state, well, you're going to have to check with your LTAP center to see if it meets the standards. Now, we have about 30 of us online this morning, so that helps me out. We're going to do a little bit of morning exercise. You've been on one of these before, you've seen this. We're going to do a little welcome, and we're going to use Poll EV to help figure out who is here today. Okay? We talk about the planning process. So first, who do you work for? The county, state, federal, consultant, town, city or village, tribal, contractor, or we at least have one honest person who says they work for the weekend. Let's see what we got here. Okay, quite a few county folks today, some state or federal. Okay, some consultants, a couple of towns, a city. And again, if you can't access it, you can put it into the Q&A. And if you put, let's just see what we've got here. Okay, so we got quite a blend today. That's good. I like that. That actually makes it more interesting in my mind. Okay. What's your job? Are you an administrator? Are you the commissioner or highway superintendent? Are you an engineer by trade? Are you a supervisor for crews out in the field? Are you just part of the field? That would be none of the above. Or are you a board member? We'd love to see some board members on these things. Let's see what we got today. Today we have some none of the above. If you put none of the above in, put into the Q&A what is your title? What is it that you do? That helps me quite a bit in terms of what I might cover, what I might not cover when I get to things. So we have a project manager, okay, for the other. So we have mostly engineers today, probably looking for those PDHs. I can understand that. So this is going to be a little different than you might expect for the planning process, but we'll talk about that, okay? And then, of course, we have a whole bunch of variety of other folks, including a board member. Cool. I'd like to see that. Okay. Now, where are you from? In this case, it's sort of fun. You get to click on the map where you're from. And again, if you can't access the polls, you can always put in the Q&A where you're from. Let's see what we have, a variety of folks. We have one person on the boat out in Lake Ontario, trying to get one last week before the weather turns. Nice hot day, probably a good day to be out there on the lake. Okay. I like it, a good variety of folks from all over the state. Okay. Sounds good. Now, when most of you read all of this, descriptions, it's on our website, and you start to log in. Ooh, we have a Canadian. Cool. Hey. You probably were thinking we were going to do something like this. This is the project development process the state DOT has on their website, which looks a lot like the game of life. Whenever I see this, all I can think of is a little car with the pins in it moving around. That's what it reminds me of. So that could be something we could be looking at. But no, we're not going to get into that level in 1 hour, though that's a very useful thing. And I know what everybody here is thinking. You're going, David, the font is too small. I can't read it. It's okay. We're going to cover this in a little bit more detail next week as part of a workshop that we're going to be holding on the federal aid process. If you're doing something with federal aid, this is actually a pretty good process. In fact, it's one you're going to need to follow. But one thing you can do is you could take this overall project development process and keep it simple and just think of it as a planning, scoping, design, construction, and operations and maintenance process. And that's just one way. There are multiple ways we could look at the planning process. I'm going to do a slightly different focus today, but I want you to realize this is just one way of many you can look at a project. Heck, if you're doing federal aid itself, the FHWA, has its own flow chart. Okay? And in their case, they're worried a lot about the efficient and effective use of federal funds. And so they've got a very different scope. You'll notice they don't even have operations and maintenance on here because once the project is constructed and done, and you've got all the audits cleared, it's handed off to the owner, whether that's a state or a local agency or even an MPO, and they're going to be letting it go. So their process, while it's similar, is different. And if you're working with the local programs bureau at the state DOT, they actually have a wheel to walk through the process step by step by step by step. And each step gets approval before you move to the next step. Again, we're going to cover this in a lot more detail next week with a local federal aid workshop that's going to be from 9:30 to 3. Yes, we got plenty of breaks. We're not going to be on the web that long. It's all web-based. And if you're interested in that, you can log in. And what's cool is if you opened up your chat pod, there's a link so you can download and link to it. And I'm going to see, I don't know how many people are currently registered. Last time I looked, it was about 45. I suspect that number will pop up in my box here in a little bit, and I'll be able to tell you for sure what's going on. But let's just start about the planning process. How long does it take you to take a project from inception to construction? I just say that. I'm not giving you any details. Yeah. If you're talking about capital projects, yeah, we're probably talking anywhere from 1 to 4 years. Somebody put in D in the Q&A, so that means more than 5 years. And if it's a big federal aid project, yeah, some federal aid projects like the ID1 rebuild up in Syracuse, that's decades in the making, okay? And some of you put down less than a year. What I want to do is talk about any project that we're doing. And that could be from a very small, less than a day, you've literally got to do it tomorrow, up to ones that are big federal. The processes aren't that different, but some of the details might be, and these are the things to think about. By the way, there's 50 of you signed up for next week, so we'd love to have more. Now, obviously, if it's a federal aid project, it's going to take longer, and it sometimes feels like it's taking forever. It's okay. There's reasons for that, and we'll talk a lot more about that next week if you join it. What I want to talk about instead are project plannings that we do on an everyday basis. Everything from small things like replacing a culvert pipe to doing a chip seal to even just setting up a work zone. Let's talk about that project planning step by step. Now, obviously, every project starts with enthusiasm. Everybody wants to get going. There's a bit of disillusionment because things just aren't going according to Hoyle. There's some delay that occurs due to weather, supply chains. We're going to talk about these things in more detail. Well, of course, as we get into this time of year, Labor Day hits, we start to panic, and then we're trying to figure out, well, who's to blame? So we search for the guilty. We can't find it, what's going on, because maybe it's out of our control. So they're going to be punishing somebody, usually the innocent, of course. And then we have praise and honors for the non-participants. We have a ribbon cutting for people who weren't involved in the first place. Now, yeah, that can happen. If we get a project like this one here, you've probably seen this picture before if you've been to any of our webinars. This is a group putting in security ballards around a building with quickset cement. And yes, in this particular case, I can imagine they got to that exact same thing. They were excited. We're going to put up these security ballards. It'll be a nice day. They get out there and there's things going on. And all of a sudden you realize, wait a second, I can't get out. There's a bit of a panic. Who's at fault? But eventually it gets done. And this is what happens. So what I want to do is start with a project exercise. This is one we do in the federal aid class. But today I want to do it slightly differently. But just think about it. If you wanted to have an ice cream sundae, on a day like today, that's something you might think about. Nice, cool ice cream sundae. I want you to think about that whole process from beginning to end on an ice cream sundae. Okay? Now, it's called a scope exercise because that's what I've got it in poll everywhere, but it could be a project exercise. I just didn't bother with the names. So what would you need to have? What's the whole process from beginning to end to have an ice cream sundae? And I haven't given you any details. I just want to see what you come up with to start. You got to have a bowl. That's pretty good. I like that. It's a good starting point. Okay. And again, if you can't put it in, throw it in the Q&A and gotta have ice cream. Really have to have an ice cream sundae with ice cream. You got to have your ingredients. You got to have a scoop and a spoon to eat it with. Yeah. One time we did this, people forgot a spoon. Yeah. You want syrup. You got to have your utensils. You might need a freezer available. That's a good thinking. Okay. Somebody put cherry in the Q&A. Yep, got to have a cherry on top. It's hard to have a good ice cream sundae without that cherry if you're a big fan of the maraschino cherries. Yep. So think about the process. Now, we just quickly threw this together without thinking about it, but really we need to be a little bit more precise about this. So let's go back through, and I'm going to clear the results here purposely. There we go. And I hit clear. And we're going to go to the next slide. Let's talk about this process a little bit more precisely. let's think about project planning step by step, not the panic mode, but what we really should be doing for anything we do. Okay? So the first thing we have to do is develop a scope. Okay? That's why I like to do that little exercise. Think about what is the scope of a particular project. This is where we're going to be doing some of the engineering. If it's needed, it may not be. You might be able to use somebody else's engineering they've already done. That's what the sign manuals do. They've already done the engineering for us. You're then going to mobilize out to the site. Think about an ice cream sundae. What do you got to mobilize? What do you got to be ready for? What prep work do you need to have for making your ice cream sundae? You're then going to construct your sundae or your project. You got to clean it up. Now, we ate our ice cream sundae. Nobody put anything about cleaning it up. But if you think about it, a real project needs to be ready to do the next project. And if you're going to have an ice cream sundae, you got to be cleaned up, ready to go. Operations, in this case, you're going to eat your sundae, okay? And then you're going to evaluate. Now, we may not think about that directly, but really when you think about it, if we go back to our project exercise, did you like that ice cream sundae? Do you want to repeat that? Do you want a different flavor next time? What is it makes it good, makes it bad? So let's do that same exercise, but I want you to think about those items, okay? So I'm going to highlight it so you can start putting your answers in, but I'm going to go back to the project list. So think about all of these steps. So when you start putting answers in, don't forget any of these 7 steps. So what is your scope? What do you have to do to get ready to go? What do you have to mobilize? What prep work do you need to do? What's the construction technique that you might use to make your ice cream sundae? What is your cleanup process? What are your operations? Obviously eating it. And then did you like it or not? So let's see what people come up with this time. We remembered a napkin this time. Yeah, when you're eating it, you need a napkin. You need towels. You still need that cup. You still need paper. You might want an appetite. You still got to have that scoop. By the way, we still got to have that ice cream. You might need some soap to wash everything up when you're done. Okay. Okay. So this time we haven't put ice cream in. I'm waiting for ice cream to show up. Okay. The whole idea of a planning process is to go through the entire thing, whether it's making an ice and eating an ice cream sundae or whether it's putting a chip seal down. Think about the whole process, and a good planning process walks us through the entire thing before we turn a bit of soil or we pull out the ice cream out of the freezer. Okay? So let's just think about going back to that sundae, and we're going to do this now with some engineering projects in a minute. But think about first you do the scope and the engineering. Are you really building an ice cream sundae or just some chocolate ice cream with some syrup on top? What is the ice cream sundae you want to build? You got to mobilize, which means you probably got to get everything ready. That means you've got to go to the grocery store and get all the supplies. You got to make sure you have all the dishes you need. If you're serving 5 people and you only got 4 bowls, maybe you got to clean a couple up and get them ready to go. Okay? You're going to be doing some prep work. You're going to bring everything out so you can build the sundae. Maybe having a station to build that with on site, on the counter. Okay? You're going to actually build the ice cream sundae. And then you're going to clean up after you're done. Now, again, this is a classic example. We list it step by step, but the reality is you're probably going to eat before you finish cleaning it up because you don't want everything to melt. But this is the kind of thing we have to think about. And then we don't explicitly do this when we're eating food, but really, did you evaluate it? Did you really like what you did, or are you going to change it next time? So just think about all of those steps. It's a lot more than you might realize going on, okay? Now, one of the things you might want to think about for our projects when we're starting to talk about local highways or even state highways is, do you have standard operating procedures? Now, this is linked in your handout. And again, if you open the chat pod up, it'll pop up in the chat pod. Are there things you do every single week or sometimes every single day that you need to write a standard operating procedure? You don't need to do that for everything, but it's really a good idea to have a standard operating procedure for certain activities. And you can go on the internet, you can talk to your colleagues. That's what standards are actually for. They do a lot of this work for us. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But you might want to think about everything you do. Do you need to have a scope? When do you need to have engineering? And we'll go through some examples of this to talk about the process. One of the most important things is to know where you're starting and know where you're going. So this is a flight that I took many years ago from Detroit, Michigan to Indianapolis, Indiana. That's a flight that you're in the air about 30, 35 minutes. It's a pretty dang short flight. But as you can see, this is a picture from FlightAware on the web, and it shows the location of the thunderstorms in the area when I landed. And you can imagine what they were doing. It was a bumpy flight. We curled all around, and we didn't go straight. We took off, okay, and we wound up circling, start to go south, but then realized we couldn't land. We circled a little bit, went around the southern side of the storm, circled a couple of times over Terre Haute, and started to head down towards, I think it was all the way down into Kentucky, Louisville, to go get fuel. When the line cleared enough, we could turn around, and we actually went back and landed in Indianapolis. We were in the air 2 hours and I think it was 30 minutes. But again, as long as you make sure you know where you're starting, you know where you're ending, and you're prepared for the delay, you can make that work. Though obviously in this case, much more delay, and they would have had to go somewhere else because planes don't like it when they run out of fuel. Keep that in mind. That's something that's pretty important as part of the process. Part of the scope, part of the engineering is to know where you're starting and where you're going to finish. And one of the biggest problems we see in the world of planning and in the world of engineering is we get scope creep. You know, everybody loves to improve things. And we developed, say, a tire swing. You've all probably seen the cartoon on the web of the tire swing that got redesigned into something super fancy. And this happens to be a new swing they put on the Cornell campus. It was donated by, I think it was a couple. I have to go back and look. But the whole point is, I've seen that happen. We've all seen that happen, where what you really wanted was a tire swing, but because, oh, we can improve this, we can improve that, we can get scope creep. And just think about any project that you've got, whether it's a paving project or whether it's a bridge. Is it really part of the scope? Did you include it in the original plan? And that's why it's really important during the planning process to go through everything. Essentially, you're going to be building during planning the entire project on a piece of paper or a whiteboard or in your head, but better yet, write it down. Because scope creep can get us in big trouble. So be very aware of that. Once you lock that scope down, be careful you don't change it. Though we'll talk about times when you might want to change it. And there are a couple of examples where it's pretty important to do so. Part of this whole planning process is you develop a timeline and you develop a schedule. Okay? We all know those timelines can get pretty important. They can be hard to meet sometimes. Right now, again, I had said during our bumper banter about half an hour ago, a lot of folks are worried about trying to get things buttoned up before the end of the year. It's hard to believe in a day when it's going to be up 90 that, hey, we don't have much time left, but fall is a coming. And if you're doing work with emulsions, even work with concrete, you got to be aware of the timeline and the schedule. Now, we like to joke in the world of construction, good, fast, and cheap, pick any two. While that's not exact, it actually is more applicable than you might think. It's funny, I gave a lecture to some students, mentioned that, went on a field tour of a construction site, and the project manager said the exact same thing. And we know that that happens. Sometimes we have to do things a little bit faster, maybe spend a little bit more money to get them done to meet our timeline, to meet our schedule. What's the weather doing to us? Are we delayed? So these are all part of the process, and we have to think about that timeline and that schedule. Pretty important stuff to deal with. This, of course, during that beginning phase, that scope and engineering phase, is when we start to develop our preliminary budget. Now, there's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So we have to worry about the budget that we've got. And we actually had a webinar on this whole subject, costing things out, earlier this year. You're welcome to borrow a spreadsheet. In fact, it's on the handout that we use to help develop costing for any projects that you're doing. And I use a bad acronym, MILE, for this. I count my materials, my invoice, my labor, and my equipment to calculate the cost. And the nice thing is, once you set this up in a spreadsheet, just like a standard operating procedure, it's easy to modify it for the next project. Because to me, part of the planning process is getting ready for the next project, and why not take advantage of what you've already done and see where you can improve and see what you can change out. This is where we're going to be starting to think about putting in contingencies. Typically, we try to do 5 or 10% for a budget. The more you know, the less contingency you have to have, but you got to have something because you don't know for sure what's going on. But on the other hand, you got limited pot of money. And then, of course, you're going to have to worry about schedule issues. What happens if, something breaks down, delivery can't be made, okay? Now is the actual time to think about those construction problems. So let's just ask you on the poll. So type in here some typical construction problems you've seen on jobs in the last 2 or 3 years. Just think about, give me some examples of some things that have come up as construction problems for you in the last couple of years. And again, if you can't access the poll, you can throw that in to the Q&A. Weather, yep, weather is always one that kicks us in the head a lot. And we'll talk about weather a lot more here in a little bit, though in an hour you can only cover so much. Right-of-way issues, yep. Subcontractors, delays in getting materials, lead time, breakdowns of equipment, what's going on underneath subsurface. Yeah. Now is the time to think about, do you need to build in some slack time? Do you need to think about having an alternative backup? What's available, what's not available? We'll talk more about that, but those construction problems, we want to try to catch those early and come up with plans, backup plans, if we possibly can. Now, when you're all said and done with this process, one of the things I bring this up, and I think it's something we don't do enough, but I know why. But think about when you're done. We like to write up budgets that have $38,643.16. Do we really know that? From a budgeting standpoint, do we really know that? Just imagine if you were still trying to do things with a slide rule. Calculators will do some pretty amazing things, and they'll give us precision down to the 10th of a cent. But do we really know that, especially in the budgeting phase? No, we don't. What we're doing is we're trying to maximize every penny that we've got available, so we're going to be putting in some numbers that, truth be told, probably aren't that accurate. Just keep in mind what's really accurate and what's really precise. Yeah, I want to spend every dime I've got. But from a budgeting standpoint, what do you really know? You probably know 3 digits at best. Maybe 4 in some cases, but just be aware of that as you're calculating out everything. Now, we need to mobilize. In the case of our ice cream sundae, that means we're going to have to go down and get our stuff in the freezer. We're going to have to make sure everything is ready to go so we can get out to the site and mobilize. This is the world's largest snow creature ever built. At least it was when it was built in Minnesota. And just imagine what they had to do to mobilize for this. They had not only had to mobilize the equipment and the crane, but they also had to mobilize the snow. They had to make sure they had enough snow to actually build this thing so that it could survive. And of course, they had to do some engineering to make sure that you built something this tall. Is it going to be strong enough, or is it going to collapse under its own weight? So you got to mobilize. So one of the first things you always want to ask yourself, if you know what you're planning on doing, is do you have the right equipment, enough equipment, and enough personnel? If you need 25 trucks, you got to have 25 truck drivers. If you need a specialty crane like they had for building the snow creature, you got to have a crane operator. You got to have the crew to help manage and work that crane out. Do you need to have specialty equipment? If you're doing chip seals, for instance, do you have a distributor? If you're putting in a culvert, do you need a small crane? As part of your scoping process, make a list of everything that you need. Easiest time to do it is before you get started, because you got to order it. There's probably a lead time to get some of these things. We already found when we did the ice cream example, we forgot a napkin. Napkin may not be important to a 3-year-old, but boy, if your face is covered with chocolate sauce, you might want to have a napkin to clean things up. What is it that you really need? One of the most critical ones, in fact, probably the one where I see the biggest issues when I've traveled around, is do we have enough trucks? So how many trucks do you actually need on a job? If it's a chip seal or a paving job or even a concrete pour, how many trucks do you need to keep things working? Because we don't want that chipper to stop. We don't want that paver to stop. We want that concrete pumper to just be pumping all the time. So to do that, that means we have to have enough trucks. Well, you can get complicated. There are books written on this with slack time and all these calculations. I just use a simple calculation. I'm a firm believer in keeping it simple. Okay? How many trucks do I need? Well, it's just T equals CD. Pretty simple. Where T is the number of trucks, D is the discharge time at the location, whether it's paving or chip sealing or concrete, and C is the cycle time. Okay? So the cycle time. What does the cycle time include? Over in the Q&A, give me some examples of things that we need to include in the cycle time. Give me some examples of things we need to include in the cycle time. Over in the Q&A. I'm not doing this one with a poll this time. I'm going to make you do the Q&A. See if y'all come up with the same answers I came up with. You got a setup for the equipment. Well, hopefully the setup for the equipment was done as part of that mobilization, getting ready to do the work. So that's actually before you actually start to pour the concrete, before you start driving down the road. Pre-stockpiling materials for stone, for instance. Yep. Trip length. Yeah. And not just trip length, but trip time. You know, if you're here in Ithaca, New York, and you're hauling from a concrete plant on the east side of Ithaca, there's not a lot of traffic. But if you had to go through downtown up the other side, that's going to increase your time. So it's not just the trip length, but the cycle time is going to include the time to get to places. So you have to worry about traffic. You got the arrival time. You got to locate the truck. You got to offload the material. That's the discharge time. Payroll. Well, you got to worry about paying people. Okay. But is this going to change the cycle time? Well, only if you got a disgruntled employee who doesn't want to keep working. Okay. So let's see. Did we get everything? I don't think we got everything. We need the discharge time, obviously. Okay. Yeah, somebody put in the load up time. Yeah. So we have the round trip time, the time to get from the facility, go pick up your material and come back. Because a lot of times we're going to obviously have those trucks repeating the cycle. Okay. You got the load up time at the facility, load the truck up, which could include, by the way, a waiting time while they're waiting for others to get loaded. So you might want to be talking to the plant about what's the availability. Are you going to be using a silo and it's your silo and you don't have to share it, or you're going to have to be sharing with somebody else? You might be able to reduce this by getting pre-stockpiled materials ahead of time. And then you have to have loaders, of course, on there to get things done. One that we don't think about enough, and yet I think it's actually a pretty important one, is do you have some break time in there? Did you allow people to take and stop and get a cup of coffee or get rid of some coffee? That's part of the cycle time. Now, of course, when you talk to the truck drivers, make sure they understand when they can and can't break. It's one thing to take a break on an empty truck, but you haul an asphalt on a cold day, don't let them break from the time they pick it up till the discharge. Because if asphalt gets too cold, you might have to lose it. And yeah, trucks like the platoon. Do you want them doing that or not? The disadvantage, of course, if they platoon like that, they like it, but that means your cycle time is going to go up because they're waiting for each other. What is your contingency? Okay. When do you deal with those kind of issues? So think that whole process through. And when you get done, round up. If you calculate that you need 13 trucks because of the cycle time, don't get 13 trucks, get 14, maybe even 15. I'd rather have an extra truck or two, depending on what you're doing and the weather, of course. Too many trucks is usually not the problem. It's usually almost always too few. Okay. Now you got to have your supplies and your stockpiles. What's your supply chain issue? This is a building they're building here on the Cornell campus, and you can see they're getting ready to pour the concrete slab. It's going to be 2 feet thick. It's going to be several hundred yards of concrete in 2 different pours. And you'll notice there's only rebar on half because they're having a supply chain issue. They got to be able to get the rebar in for the supplies. Do you have that in there? What's your slack time? What are the critical path items? What are the things that are going to stop the job that you have to get done first. Concentrate on those things. We like to talk about critical path, but did we actually walk through and do the actual charts to come up with? And where are you going to stockpile the materials? In this case, I got actually quite a bit of room to stockpile the materials, but where are you going to stockpile? If you're doing chip seals, for instance, do you haul from one place or do you set a series of stockpiles that you can pull from? So keep that in mind as you're developing. What is your supply chain issue going on? Okay. Before you do the work, you have to prep. Okay. So one of the things we like to make is a green chili. Okay. Tastes great, delicious, but the chili part is easy. It's like painting a house. The painting's not the hard part. It's the prepping. So in this case, it was the prepping of the green chilies, the roasting. I did have somebody else do the roasting down at the grocery store. But then you got to come home and you got to peel the roasted peppers off so you have them ready to go. Cut them up. That's the hard part. It's the prep work. The actual making isn't hard. Think about the kind of things you have to do to prep a job. So if I ask you, what is the on-site prep that you're doing on a job site? Think about chip seals, culvert pipe, paving a road, putting up a work zone. What kind of things are you going to have? Let's see what you guys have come up with here. Yeah, work zone traffic control. You got to prep that ahead of time. Okay. What else have you got to think about before you get started? Do you need silt fence on a construction site? Ooh, I like that one. That's a good one. What else you got? Flaggers. Yeah. Utilities, which goes all the way back to scope. What utilities do you have to deal with? Markouts. If you're digging in the ground, did you call 811? What permits? Ooh, we'll come back to permits in just a second. Well, I like that one. Okay. Do you have the cash flow to pay everybody? Okay. Think about all the steps. And you probably have not thought about everything, but let's just add a couple that you didn't put in here. If you're pouring concrete, did you spray the forms down? Are they ready for the concrete to be poured? If you're putting down paving, when are you going to be putting down your tack coat? Okay. You got to put it ahead, but you don't want to be out there too long to get traffic over the top of it. Do you need to tarp things? Okay. Do you have to sweep the site? If you're doing certain work, you got to sweep it. Okay. If you're pouring concrete, where are you going to dump your waste concrete? Do you have a place to clean your trucks off before they leave the site? Start making that list. You're literally in the planning process, building the entire project from soup to nuts, again, in your office on a piece of paper. Think those things through. So let's look at a couple of the more critical ones once my mouse wakes up. Where did my mouse go? It does this some days. There we go. Okay, let's talk about the more critical ones here. Yeah, somebody said speedies. Well, I do want to mention right-of-way and permits. These are the two that cause the biggest issues. When we talk to folks with state DOT and federal highway for federal aid jobs, by far the two biggest issues are the right-of-way and the permits. Do you know your right-of-way? Are you in your right-of-way, especially on roads by use at the town and village level and even county roads? What is your right-of-way? Do you have a permission to go off the right-of-way and do the work? Do you need to get that? You actually probably need to be thinking about the scoping process. But as a minimum, you got to be doing this before you can start construction. You got to have your permits in place. If you're working on a project in 2024, now is the time to be applying for the permits if there's a stream involved, not in April when you want to start working in May. It takes time. Yes, I have gotten a permit through the DEC and Army Corps in less than 2 weeks, but that takes time to build the relationships up. Normally it takes a little longer than that. And if you're going to be doing things like a speedies permit or a general permit for a trout stream, it's going to take some time. And of course, Workzone traffic control, you can actually modify your scope thinking about what you might be doing for Workzone traffic control. Maybe just close the whole roadway off. That makes it faster to build the project, but that means you got to set up a detour if it's not obvious. So these are all interplay. That's why I like to write these things down ahead of time if you possibly can. And then finally, we're doing construction. Now, construction can be anything from maintenance work to major capital projects, but you all know, again, the kind of typical construction problems that you've got. We've been listing them already, okay? And this is the ones people have been putting in. We just kept it and put it back up. I've seen a few new ones. People speeding in a job site. Is there a railroad? Oh, that's a fun one. I like that. COVID. Anybody thought they knew COVID was coming? Boy, did that change things. Okay. It may still, health still changes things. Our health, the weather today, it's going to be above 90. Are there jobs you just can't do because it's so hot? Um, what is the crew? Do you need to have more breaks because of that? Did inflation make your budget go bad? So these are all the kind of problems that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And if we don't think about them now, we could have them later on hit us in the tail. So let's talk about 3 or 4 of the more critical things when it comes to construction. Obviously, weather is the biggest issue. We mentioned that it was definitely showing up both in our delay problems and our construction problems. Do you know the limitations for your work? What is the weather where you have to shut down or keep working? So in the case of a chip seal, you obviously need the pavement temperature to be above 50, but what's the weather going to be like that day? If it's going to rain that day, maybe you got to hold off. Maybe you just got to say, well, I don't like it, but we're going to hold off. And we're not going to be able to chip seal today. If you're paving, do you go ahead and empty the trucks that have got asphalt concrete in them? Or do you say, nope, it's just raining too hard. We're just going to wind up wasting that asphalt concrete. There's an economic cost to doing so, but there's also an economic cost to putting poor quality material down. And the temperatures where it's too hot to do certain activities. You can get a flash set, for instance, with a chip seal, which is no fun. So what are the limitations? Write them down. Just make a list and make sure everybody on the crew knows about it. And who has the authority to shut a job down or delay a job is pretty important. And then who makes the call for shut down and keep working? And do you have to do extra steps if it's wet? Are there things you have to think about doing differently? Do you have to cover the concrete for a concrete sidewalk sooner? Or do you have to even put up some kind of tarps to help keep things in good shape? Okay. And then, of course, is the work week. So just by showing hands, I'm going to go over here and clear all the hands. How many of you work 4-day weeks, all or part of the year? Raise your hand if you work 4-day weeks, all part of the year. Let's see how many of you we've got. May not be a lot of you today, but if I was to ask this folks working for towns and counties and villages, a lot of you will be raising your hands. If I had to bet, my gut instinct is it's probably about anywhere from 50 to 70% of the towns and about half the villages, and the counties vary quite a bit, that at least part of the year are working 4-day weeks. Okay? Now, there's actually some advantages to the 4-day week. Again, whether you do it full-time or whether you just do it part-time. There's some disadvantages too, because contractors, they work when the sun is shining. When the weather's good, they want to work. So what do you do about that? Do you say, well, we're only doing chip seals or paving with our own crew 4 days a week? Do you hire a contract to do all of that work? Or do you say, no, we're going to do overtime. We're going to pay the cost of the overtime because it's much more efficient to take advantage of the weather and to take advantage of the time of year. This is part of the calculations that you need to be thinking about ahead of time. Does it pay for itself? A lot of times it might, okay, because there's a limited season of when you can get work done, and you may want to think about that. But that cost of that overtime is something to deal with. And even if you're only working 4 days, if the weather's good, do you start early and end late? And of course, it's not here, but do you have a contract? How does this all work within a contract, both for the construction company that you might have as a contractor or subcontractor and your own crew? And of course, now during the planning process is when we want to be thinking about all of these activities. Okay. Now, I'm going to bring up something that everybody knows. So I'm going to have you tell me what it stands for in the Q&A. What does QA, QC stand for? And put that in the box for me. Quality assurance for the QA. Good. See if somebody's got the QC for me. And quality control. Very good. Yes. And I've seen it done both as quality control and quality assurance, QC, QA, but normally it's QA, QC. It's not quit asking, quit checking. Okay. It's a little more than that. There are lots of people who will argue about what this means. Some people say that the agency is the QA and the contractor is the QC. To remember it, some people say that quality control are the numbers, quality assurance are the techniques. Again, we could spend a whole hour talking about QA, QC issues, but the key is, do you have a QA, QC plan? What are you going to be checking? What is your testing protocol? What are you going to be sampling? Who's going to do inspection? Now, two things about this that I think are critical that we don't see enough at the local level, and I think even at the state level we could see more. One is we need to have inspectors. But what's the role of an inspector? It's not to, quote unquote, meet the spec. That can be a part of the job, but the job of an inspector is to not be doing anything but inspection, to look for those things that can be checked and to make sure not just that they're documented, but what are we going to do about it? What are we changing because of that? Way too often I've seen inspection reports and I've talked to folks with the state DOT and they see someone wrote something down, but they didn't say anything. So it just became part of the record, but it's too late to fix it 6 months from now. The inspector needs to be part of the team to make changes as we go along. That's what quality assurance really means. And the numbers just help us. Okay. And what are you testing? What are you sampling? Every concrete delivery you get, maybe not every truck, but every concrete delivery has to have some testing with it for slump, air content, strength for cylinders. We should be doing the same thing for everything we get. Asphalt, check the temperature. Emulsions, take a sample. You can't test it later on once you sprayed it on the ground. So have a testing plan. Even if you wind up just sampling and never testing it, you can't go back. So do you have a plan to sample your gravel? Do you have a plan to sample your paint? Test the thickness, all these kind of things. So I've already given you a bunch, but what are the kind of things you can think of for a QA that you need to have for quality assurance? And of course, this leads into quality control as well, but what are the kind of things you can think of? Maybe some that I haven't mentioned. Pictures, ooh, very good. I love pictures. We all carry a camera with us these days. You can take lots of pictures. Okay. Do you have a plan? You check the plan. Are your people trained? Ooh, if you train your people, they might leave. But if you don't train them and they stay, yeah, good point. Do you have a daily log? Okay. On that daily log, by the way, make sure you put the who did it, where you are, what you're doing, and today's weather. Absolutely critical. Do you need certain signatures on things? Okay. What else we got? I'm looking for two more things to see if they pop in here for my QA, quality assurance. Yeah, one of them is the plan. Do you have a QA plan? But what is your spec? Make sure part of your QA you're developing is to make sure you have a specification that you're working against. So if you don't have a spec, how do you have a quality assurance plan if you don't even know what you're working against? So you have to have a specification. What's the gravel quality that you need that you're going to be working against? Okay, so quality is important, but what are you going to be quality against? And then for your quality assurance and quality control, are you using a performance-based plan? Or are you going to be using a method-based? Or in a lot of cases, we use both. For instance, in concrete, we talk about finishing techniques and how it has to be compacted, i.e. vibrated into place. But we also take a cylinder, so we're testing it. That's a strength test. We're going to be doing the same thing for almost everything that we do. We're going to have things that we can measure and things that we look at the method. And you may want to look at both. A lot of times we only look at one or the other, but if you're only doing measurement, are you really checking everything you need to check? If you're only doing method, how do you know whether something meets a certain strength standard or a quality standard later on if you only watch someone do it, like rolling gravel? Is it dense enough? Okay. Now, of course, this can lead to change orders. People will say, I hate change orders, they're evil. No, they're not evil. Time extensions are not evil. This is the real world. Okay, we just want to make sure we've done a good job in the planning process so we don't wind up like our joke picture here, where the original contract's the dinghy on the back and the change orders is where the real money was made. If you don't have a good plan or a good spec or a good engineering drawing, that can happen because the contractors, they'll know that plan better than you will. And you can find out the hard way you missed something. Okay. And again, in a longer period of time, we could talk a lot more about change orders, but think about what's a legitimate change order. What are the change orders that really need to probably be not improved, things like that. And then my favorite step that we don't do enough of is cleaning up. You want to, when you're done, clean up the project. Get rid of any waste materials, properly dispose of them. Make sure the site looks as clean as possible when you're done. Police the area, as my old track coach used to say. Okay? Not only is it good for the environment and the community, but it means you're ready for the next job. All the parts have been put back up. All the safety equipment is where it belongs. It's been checked out. Before you put it away, is it in good shape, ready for the next job? In an emergency, if you have to go grab it, you know right where it is. And like it or not, it's great for public relations. If you've got a nice, clean job when you're done, you're going to have that ribbon cutting ceremony. It really looks nice when it's all nice and finished. Everything's working really well. So keep that in mind. Cleaning up is not just getting ready for the next job, but it's public relations. It's part of the whole process. Okay? Then we're going to start operating things. We're going to make sure that they're working properly. We're all going to be rowing together and checking things out and watching it. To me, operations, what you're going to be doing, should actually be back to the beginning. It's part of the scope. Okay? I took this photograph. I was in Cedar Rapids for a conference earlier this summer. And when they put the interstate across the river, because of the way they've got the ramps, they actually have a ramp that only has a 9-foot, 2-inch clearance. And so they put these little hanging bars to keep trucks from hitting the bridge. Yeah, part of the scope probably should have been, maybe we should be thinking about where we're putting the roads. Maybe that road should have just been closed off. Think about how it's going to operate, what it's going to be doing later on. Does the drainage work? Does the traffic light work? Okay. So that also means that you want to operate things for a little bit, and you might have to go back and change it. And that's okay. It really is allowed. But that means you need to have a plan to go back and evaluate. Do we do that? No, none of us do. We all know we could do it more. Are we on track? Are we going where we want to go? I always like to tell people my favorite time to do an evaluation or an inspection is a couple of weeks after you've done the job, especially in the case of drainage. You've probably seen this picture I've shown where 2 weeks after they put this new pipe in, a hole was being formed. It's easy to fix today with a little rock or a big piece of concrete. But 2 months from now, that hole could be enough to where it's threatening the roadway. Okay? Are the traffic patterns working on a new traffic light? Is the drainage good? Did you put in a handicap ramp that now holds water? So just think about, what are the biggest issues you've seen with brand new projects? Just give me a few examples of issues you've seen with brand new projects. Give me a couple examples. And think about where you might have been able to solve that with the planning process. A washout. Did you actually create the erosion problem? Yeah. Utility work afterwards because you damaged the utilities because you vibrated. Quality that didn't meet the spec. Yeah. Ponding, especially I see ponding with paving jobs, ADA work. Did it meet the criterion? So did you have enough QA, QC? Okay. Cracks in the concrete or cracks in the asphalt? Yep. Exceeded capacities too soon. Did we actually plan for enough traffic? We thought there wasn't going to be that much, but all of a sudden there's more traffic. It might not have actually been a surprise if we'd really thought about it in the planning process. What's going to happen after you're done? What you can do when you build this project as part of the planning process is when you're done, write down what you think the most likely issues are and think, maybe we should change the engineering and the scope now before we start the rest of the process. This is the time to be thinking about those issues, which again goes back to your standard operating procedures, your SOP. Those SOPs are really valuable, but don't let them become something that sits on a shelf and never review. Go back and check them out and go, maybe we need more trucks. Maybe we need to change what kind of equipment we've got. Yes, these are long-range plans, but it can make a huge difference if you've got a good standard operating procedure as we move into the future. Now, we've been talking about project planning step by step. We talk about the scope and the engineering. We talk about mobilization, getting ready, going to be doing prep work, construction, cleanup, and operations, and of course, evaluation. And of course, in the case of our ice cream, that means we need to figure out what we want to eat. We want to mobilize and get all the stuff at the grocery store, make sure we got everything on the shelf, get everything prepped ahead of time, construct what we need to construct, eat it, clean it up, and figure out what we're going to do next time. But what I want to do, I've got a few minutes here. My timing worked better than I thought it would be. Haven't done this one. This is the first time we've done this webinar. It's actually been sort of fun. What I want to do is I'm going to do a series of problems, and I want you to help me with the steps. Now, before we get started, somebody asked, what is my definition for quality assurance? Again, we could spend a whole hour. There are lots of people who define this in different ways. I look at quality assurance as checking sort of the process. Do we have the right process? Quality assurance, for instance, could be a method spec where you want to make sure people roll it a certain number of times, or they apply or don't apply vibration with the equipment. But quality assurance could also be, did we sample it for testing later on with quality control? Did we have the inspectors that we needed on the job site? It's sort of the difference between written, those word problems and those just simple math problems. I see this as a word problem, the things you can write down as a plan, okay? But again, there are people who would argue with me, and they're probably right. The reality is QA/QC really needs to be as a combined activity because there's a lot of overlap. So let's pick a couple of projects. We got 5 minutes. We're going to do, I'll tell you, we'll start with this one. This is a good, simple one, very common issue for highway agencies around the state. Probably done almost entirely internal. Very, very unlikely to see this done by an outside agency, though I have spec'd out the cost of having ditching done by a contractor. So I'm going to go ahead and start the scope exercise. I'm going to clear the scope for our ice cream scoop. Let me get that done here. And I'm going to go back. And I want you to start thinking about what is all the steps, not just the scope exercise, but everything you need to think about having. The mobilization, the prep work, the construction, the cleanup, the operations, the evaluation for ditching, okay? So just spend a couple of minutes putting those in for a ditching operation. Okay, are you going to have Workzone traffic control? What are your specifications? Okay. Did you call 811? Yep, you're digging with a machine. You're going to call 811. Okay. Do you have, how many trucks are you going to have? Where are you going to dispose of the materials when you're done? Your spoils. Okay. Do you need any permits? Are there utilities you have to worry about? Okay. I'm looking for 3 things here, and we'll do one more and let y'all go for the day. Okay. Do you have enough labor? Okay. Do you have to survey it out, or are you just going to do it by eye? If you're doing it by eye, you got to be very careful. How much material are you going to be pulling out? Do you have enough trucks? And what's the cleanup when you're done for ditching? Let me go back. And you tell me, is that site cleaned up? Is it ready to be operated? I hope you don't think so, because what's missing? So someone pop either in the Q&A or pop in the sweeping. I'm looking for hydroseeding or some kind of vegetative cover, something to get it ready for operations. It's not ready at this point when it looks like that, okay? So that's a perfect example. Okay, let's see. I got time for one more. Let's do, we'll do this one here. There's a couple of others we could do, but just in terms of time, this is a very common. Let's do a chip seal, a simple chip seal, okay? So again, think about the scope, the engineering. Let me clear this one here. Okay, so think about a chip seal. What are the things you're going to have for a chip seal? Okay, and again, scope. Is there any engineering? What's the mobilization? Which roads you're going to do someone has? The weather. What's the prep work? What's the construction? Okay. Operations, evaluations, things like that. Okay. What's the weather forecast? Yep. Do you have enough trucks? Okay. Do you need to shim it ahead of time and crack repair it? If you're going to do crack repairs or shimming, you're not doing that the week before. You really should be doing that the season before. How much stone? Where are you stockpiling it? Do you have enough material? You're losing material when you pick it up with your loader. How many loaders do you need? Walk through the whole process. Does it need to be sweeped ahead of time? Are you going to be doing staging? Okay. I mean, if you think about it, you should be able to do chip seal. You should be doing 8 to 9 miles a day with a good chip seal operation if you have enough equipment and trucks. Your price per square yard goes way down if you think the entire process through. So you definitely want to have more than you think you need in terms of equipment. Do you need a distributor truck? Okay. And what are the weather limitations? Realizing that the closer you get to the fall, the less chances that chip seal is going to survive, because a chip seal is not done the day you finish. It's actually going to have to cure out. The water's got to evaporate. It breaks, so you can drive on it, but it actually hasn't completely cured out for as much as a week or two in good weather, longer in the fall. So chances of it having problems. And when you're coming back to sweep later on, you definitely want to sweep. Okay. So we could do more exercises. Just keep it in mind. Everything that we do could have this. You could think about a culvert installation, and that would be a perfect example of something you could deal with. Okay? You could think about just setting up a work zone. Now that sounds like a minor thing, but think about the spacing on the signs. Which goes up first? Which goes up last? That's why we write standard operating procedures. And it really does help us later on with everything that we're going to be doing. Okay? So keep that in mind. Everything you can do can be planned. Keep it simple. You don't have to go crazy. If you want more details on the local federal aid process, which is a little bit more written down, a little more precise because of federal aid procedures, join us next week. You can go online and log in on our website, and you can find this. It's going to be from 9:30 to 3. Again, this is the last of our summer series, but we are looking at the fall. The draft schedule's already out. We're finalizing the dates, so don't hold me to that, because if an instructor can't do it, we have to move things around. But you can find all of this stuff on our website. And everybody have yourself a great week. Stay cool. Get hydrated. If you are out in the sun, put on a little sunscreen. Cover the back of that neck. Take care, everybody. We'll catch up with you. Bye-bye.